Okay, now that we have 3 sessions to go, and what you're going to get in the next 3 sessions, I had to make some decisions I had no way of knowing or assuming correctly who would be here and what prior exposure you've had to me or my content before. And so the next 3 sessions are going to be sort of a broad stroke overview of the Divine Council worldview, and in particular, this issue of the Godhead in the Old Testament. All these, thank you. All these things are interrelated in some way. And I think this one in particular is probably, arguably, the most useful in terms of apologetics, specifically addressing certain issues that you would encounter pretty quickly if you put in things like Jesus and New Testament into YouTube or Google. There are certain criticisms levied at the New Testament story, particularly about Jesus, and the whole notion of his deity and the incarnation that are sort of in vogue today. The notion that the idea of the incarnation, the deity of Christ, and therefore even the Trinity, is something either contrived by the New Testament writers, or that the New Testament writers didn't even believe, and church authorities or other who knows who inserted it back into the New Testament. This whole idea of a Godhead being sort of an invention that postdates who the real Jesus was, the historic Jesus and all that. I think what you'll see in this session will go a long way towards saying that's just an idea that is really flawed, to put it so late. And the other thing is like Jewish evangelism. In my own experience, just to give you a little story here, when I was at Wisconsin, we in the summers, we had this thing called senior scholars, that the grad students would get an email every year and say, hey, do you want to teach in senior scholars? And it's like, well, it's a job. So, we need some money, so sure, why not? But the thing is you got to propose something. And I didn't really know what it was. So I proposed one year, angels and or I think it was just angels like in the Bible or something really broad, because that's kind of a popular topic. And I got into the program. Well, what senior scholars was their busloads of people from Florida, senior citizens, would come up and live in the dorms for the summer. And they would take courses throughout the summer. And that was us. So it was actually really cool. You'd have hundreds of them. So I walk in the first day, and my topic is like angels and, and I get into this, what we're going to talk about today, the 2 powers in heaven stuff. And I'm about 5 minutes into this, and the look is like, it's just, I know it's not clicking. And so I try to kickstart it again, and it's just not working. And I said, what's wrong? I can tell you're just sort of not following. And some guy in the back shouts, we're all Jewish! And they were. Every one of them. I had a room of like 40 Jewish people. And I'm going through this stuff. And it's like, well, I have a decision to make. And they say God doesn't have a sense of humor. And I persevered. I went through the whole thing, and they came back for a solid week, And at the end of it, I had several, but one lady in particular that was pretty memorable. She said, my father is a cantor, in the synagogue. And she said, we never heard any of this before. And she said, I finally understand how people could become Christians in the first century. It was great, and that particular woman actually came back. Like I did it another couple of years, in the summer. I mean, there were some that were real uncomfortable, but it really showed me that there's some significant value here because they have to get over the idea of divine plurality. They're worried about that. Do I violate the Shema? The Lord our God is one. If I become a Christian, because I know what is associated with that. And so I want to go through this, and I think, again, if you have Jewish friends, and again, some of the other questions we'll hit at the end, I think this is a really useful topic. Deuteronomy 6:4 is the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The question is, what in the world does that mean? And it's actually a really tricky question, because the verse could be translated literally 6 different ways. I'll go back here. In that verse, in Hebrew, there is no verb. So you have to decide where you're going to put the predication. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. Or there's 2 references to the divine name and no verb. And so it's tricky. Just depends on what you're going to do with it. John 1:18, I mean, you look at the Shema, and then you look at the New Testament, and most of your New Testament writers, all your disciples, are going to be Jewish, and you get John who writes something like this. No one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. Wait a minute. How can you have a God at the Father's side and that God be the only God? How does that work? I mean, just look at the language. The only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. And this is a Jew. How is it that a first century Jew committed to monotheism, so committed that they would, this was a death penalty issue. This was a life and death issue. Jews who were so committed, even on pain of death, to avoid worshiping or acknowledging the Roman emperor as God. But yet they were completely willing, many of them, to embrace Jesus as Yahweh incarnate and the Messiah. Why one reaction and the other? I mean, how could they make that decision? Why was this not conceived by many Jews as a violation of the Shema and a rejection of monotheism? Because if you're Jewish in the first century and you embrace Christianity, how did you not think that was a violation? Or how did you think that was okay? That you were not violating what the God of Israel said? Here's how you could translate the Shema. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but just to give you an idea. All of them are possible. It just raises the question of how did they parse all this? And it went beyond a translation exercise. There were actually passages in the Old Testament that sort of, if you look at rabbinical material, that led to a discussion of divine plurality. And then even more so, again, you had the development of the idea of a Godhead, that there was God existing in more than one person. That is an Old Testament idea. And so I want to show you, again, sort of what contributed to that discussion. Now look at Genesis 19:24. Look at the verse, read it quickly. Do you notice anything odd about it? Well, the rabbis did. They noticed this. How can Yahweh rain sulfurous fire from Yahweh? This is kind of odd. That's what the text says. Amos 4:11. Note the first person. I have wrought destruction among you, as when God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Well, now, wait a minute. How do we get first person and third person ambiguity? We have God referenced and Yahweh referenced, but yet the speaker says in the first person, I'm the one who did this. Again, these passages, there were a whole list of them that were sort of known and in discussion. Now, in and of themselves, this is a literary concept or a verbal concept called Iliism. Referring to yourself in the third person doesn't get you to a Godhead, but it was part of the discussion. There were other things that made those passages really stand out and take on significance. This book here, The Two Powers in Heaven, is still the major work on this. If you are Jewish, if you have Jewish friends, this is the book for you if you can stand reading academic stuff. And that is Siegel, Alan Siegel, who's recently deceased, was a Jew, a rabbinic scholar, and his whole book demonstrates that the idea of a second power in heaven, a second good guy, not one good, one evil, it's not dualism, a second power in heaven who could go by the name Yahweh and could be called God, was okay in Judaism until the 2nd century AD, which is not a coincidence. 2nd century AD would be the hundreds, which is the era right after the advent of Christianity. That is not coincidental timing. Again, we're not talking Zoroastrianism or Gnosticism. These are two good guys. So the two powers, I want to show you a few passages that the rabbis tend to focus on. Exodus 15:3, literally, Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. So here, God is portrayed as a man of war, a warrior. Just hold that in your head. Daniel 7:9-13. As I looked on, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Okay, we know who the Ancient of Days is in Daniel 7. He's the guy running the show, running the meeting. This is God, right? And as I looked on, thrones, plural, were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His garment was white as snow, so on and so forth. Again, we're familiar with the language. The throne with tongues of flame, wheels of blazing fire. That's right out of Ezekiel 1. Okay. It's not a UFO. It's just what the text says it is. It's a throne. Okay. Rivers stream forth from before him, so on and so forth. And the court sat, the council sits, and the books were opened. And Daniel says, one like a human being, one like a son of man, came with the clouds of heaven. He reached the Ancient of Days and was presented to him, and dominion and glory and kingship were given to him. So, okay. We're going to talk about the phrase coming on the clouds in a moment. But the rabbis looked at this and it's like, okay, back in Exodus, Yahweh was a man of war. And here we have one like a human being that has everlasting dominion, glory, and kingship, but yet that person isn't God. How does that work? So Exodus 15 and Daniel 7 were among the two passages that were really hotly debated within the Jewish community. Now, they're not going to deny that it's there because it's there. So the question was, how do we articulate what it is we're reading? How do we understand this so that we don't violate the Shema? It's a simple question. How do we do that? You know, Siegel's pretty honest, writing as a Jew, and of course, as a Jew, he's very clear in the book. He's like, I still think this is a heresy, but back in the first century it was okay, and even earlier. He says, look, Daniel 7 could easily be describing two separate divine figures. I mean, very honest. There's more to the story, though. Let's track through a bunch of passages here. Exodus 3, what could be simpler? The burning bush. Moses tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, comes to Horeb, the mountain of God, and an angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a blazing fire out of a bush. He gazed, there was a bushel of flame. Moses said, wow, I got to check this out. And when Yahweh saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush. Question, who's in the bush? There are two in the bush. Angel and Yahweh, God, okay? Again, this was noticed. It's like, what? Boy, that's kind of odd. And the New Testament says the same thing in Acts 7 in Peter's sermon. Exodus 23 is in many ways a key passage. God says to Moses, I'm sending an angel before you to guard you on the way. Now, this is after the crossing of the Red Sea. God says, when you get on your way, I'm going to send an angel with you to bring you to the place that I have made ready. So God says, I'm going to give you this angel. I'm going to assign him to you, and he's going to take you to the promised land. Pay heed to him and obey him. Do not defy him, for he will not pardon your offenses, since my name is in him. What did he swallow 4 consonants? No. This gets us into the Old Testament theological topic of something called the name theology. The name of God, I mean, Jews still do this today. If you're a very observant Jew, you will not say Yahweh. I had one professor that wouldn't let us say that at Wisconsin. He insisted we either say Adonai, which is a substitute, means the Lord, or Hashem, which means the name. It is a circumlocution for Yahweh. It is a substitute. It means the same thing. It is Yahweh. It's just that's how you don't dare pronounce the name. Deuteronomy 12, we get passages that talk about God says, hey, now when we get to the promised land, there is going to be a specific place that God will choose, or I will choose, to establish my name there. Now, it doesn't mean that God's going to find a nice spot in the ground and, hey, give me a stick. YHWH. Okay, it's talking about the establishment of a place where the divine presence will dwell. It's the temple. Okay? Very specific location to establish the name. Psalm 20, verses 1 and 7. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob protect you. They're used interchangeably. The Lord, the name. It refers to the presence of God himself. So back in Exodus 23, when God tells Moses, you better listen to this angel, because my name is in him. I am in him. He is me embodied. He is me in human form. Don't mess with him. He will not pardon your transgressions. I'm still going to be where I am in heaven, wherever, but I will also be with you in human form. Again, to be protected by the name of God doesn't mean like, the Israelite soldiers don't go out into battle and it's like, it's looking pretty bad, fellows, all together now. YHWH. They would have looked like idiots, okay? The whole idea of being protected by the name is to be protected by God himself. Personified. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar in blazing wrath with a heavy burden, his lips full of fury, his tongue like devouring fire. So the name is even cast, again, anthropomorphically, in human form. So you go back to Exodus 23, God is with them in a visible, human way. But yet God is also everywhere else. So how can that be? We got two Yahwehs. It's kind of, sort of. What I'm getting at is they had the conceptual categories that we have as Christians. Think of the way you talk about Jesus. Well, Jesus is God. Well, he is, but he's also not. I mean, he's God, but he's not the Father. He's the Son. So we use this, again, relational hierarchical language. We affirm the deity of Christ, but yet we know that God the Father is not this one, but they're the same, but yet they're different. Okay? This is what's happening in the Old Testament. Well, we know that Yahweh is who he is, and then we got this angel guy leading us in the way, and he's him too, but just forget it. Just pack up the tent and go, okay? Deuteronomy 4, who led the people to the promised land? Out of Egypt. Was it God? Was it the angel? No, here it's the presence, the panim. Same scenario, different term. Judges 2. An angel of Yahweh comes up from Gilgal to Bochim. Let's see how much of that I got. I mean, this is an interesting story. Well, Judges 6 is actually where it really gets into it. Judges 2, we can just take the first 3 verses here. But here we have the angel of the Lord come up. This is the book of Judges. So that we've had the conquest happen. They're in the land. And he says, I brought you up from Egypt. Well, no, wait a minute. I thought it was the presence of God that did that, the panim. Well, no, wait a minute. In other passages, isn't it Yahweh, the divine name, who did that? Well, yes, it is. Here, the angel says, I brought you up from Egypt, and I said, I will never break my covenant, but you have not obeyed me. Genesis 31. The angel of God comes to Jacob in a dream and says, Jacob, and he said, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see all the goats that mate, and the flocks are striped, spotted, and mottled, for I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. And what does the angel say next? I am the God of Bethel. When Jacob left home, that's where he went. He went to a place called Bethel and encountered God there and built an altar. And yet this angel tells him, I am the God of Bethel. But wait a minute, it's an angel. It's 6 of one and half a dozen of another. It's 2 sides of the same coin. This is probably my favorite passage in the Torah, but maybe in the whole Old Testament. It's really cool, because if you have all these stories we have the advantage of having the whole Torah and actually having everything written down. And you read, again, this stuff in Exodus about the angel with the name, and the name is God, and the angel is the God of Bethel, and you get all this stuff, and then you come across Genesis 48. It's really cool. This is Jacob's deathbed blessing of Joseph's children. And we know the story about the crossing of the hands and all that kind of stuff. That's the part we remember. But the really cool stuff is what Jacob actually says. So he blesses Joseph again via his sons, saying, the God in whose ways my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked. God there is Elohim, very normal word for God. The God who has been my shepherd from my birth to this day, Elohim. The angel who has redeemed me from all harm. May he bless these lads. Oh, no, wait a minute. Shouldn't it say they? In Hebrew, it's a singular verb form. If the writer wanted to distinguish that these are 2 individuals and should not be confused, all he had to do was use a plural verb form. But he doesn't. Well, which one do you want to bless the boys? Weren't you listening, Joseph? Doesn't make any difference. May the God, the angel, may he bless these boys. It fuses the 2 together. I once showed this to a Jehovah's Witness at my door. Oh, that was fun. You came to the wrong door. Maybe you came to the right door. But, their whole, Jesus is an angel, and that makes him not God, and God's God, and Jesus is an angel, a created being. Oh, okay, I got it. Can you look at Genesis 48 for me? I mean, I probably shouldn't have told them, because now they'll come out with their own Hebrew edition and change the verb to a plural. But it's like, it was one of the few occasions where I've ever talked to a Jehovah's Witness, where at the end of, after showing that, it's like, well, it's been nice talking to you. Have a nice day. I mean, you either have to deny everything you just told me about this distance between God and an angel, or basically you need to fall down in front of me and say, what must I do to be saved? It doesn't really get any, there's really not much in between there. But again, it's really useful. The Word. Now, we're familiar with this from the New Testament, but look at the Old Testament. Believe it or not, John, in the beginning was the Word, all that. John actually gets his theology from the Old Testament. Who would have thought that? And a lot of scholars think that John just sort of made this up, or is borrowing something from Greco-Roman paganism. I'm sorry, but he probably used the Old Testament. Genesis 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Now, visions, I would suggest to you, are things you see. Just taking a wild stab at that. I think visions are things you see. So the word comes to Abraham and said, don't be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield and your great reward. 1 Samuel 3, the young man Samuel was ministering to the Lord under Eli. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. Now, we tend to think that God just never talked to anybody or never gave any revelation or a dream or anything like that. Well, the writer tells us what he means. There was no frequent vision. I would suggest to you once again that visions are things that you see with your eyes. Visual incident. Now Samuel had not yet experienced the Lord. The word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. The word hadn't been revealed to him. The Lord called Samuel again the third time. We know the story. They go back and forth, and Eli says, "Well, it's not me calling. When you hear the voice again, say, 'Hey, it's me,' and speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And that's what Samuel does. And the text says, "And the Lord," it's the divine name, Yahweh, "came and stood, calling as at other times." Samuel, and Samuel said, "Speak, for your servant hears." And Samuel grew, the end of the chapter, and the Lord, Yahweh, was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. Why? Because the Lord, Yahweh, appeared again. Well, the first time is this thing we're just reading about. Appeared again at Shiloh. The Lord revealed himself to Samuel at Shiloh by or as the word of the Lord. This is a visual, human appearance of Yahweh to the prophet, to Samuel, who's going to become, the leading prophetic figure of the day. Jeremiah 1. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you," and so on and so forth. And Jeremiah says, "Then I said, Lord God." It's Yahweh with Elohim. So Jeremiah refers to the word with the divine name. "Truly I do not know how to speak, for I'm only a boy. But the Lord, Yahweh, said to me, do not say I'm only a boy." They get into this discussion in verse 9. "Then Yahweh put out his hand and touched my mouth." That's a tactile description. It requires embodiment. What I'm getting at is a Jew who knows his Old Testament really well knows and understands that the God of Israel at times appeared as a man. And in some cases, in distinction from himself, who was still in heaven. Again, it's the same conceptual categories that we get, that we're used to discussing when we talk about the Trinity. A Godhead. cloud rider. Now, he who rides the clouds in the ancient world was a well-known title for Baal. Okay, this is an excerpt from the Ugaritic Baal cycle. Just one example, there's a bunch of them. Because people, who were not Israelites, or at least not faithful Israelites, believed that Baal was the one who controlled the heavens. He was the god of fertility and rain and the crops and all this kind of stuff. He made things grow. So he was the one in charge of the clouds. He was the cloud rider, the one who came upon the clouds. Now, here's the point. Why am I bringing that up? Because the Old Testament's going to use this phrase, and here's the point. Nobody in the ancient world didn't think that Baal was a deity. It wasn't, Baal's just kind of a lower angel kind of guy and just sort of a lower ranking, No. Baal was the guy if you weren't a follower of the God of Israel. In Canaan, it was Baal. He was the dude. So that becomes important when the Old Testament does things like this. This phrase occurs 5 times in the Old Testament. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, through the skies in his majesty. Who's the charioteer of the skies, of the clouds? Psalm 68, sing praises to the Lord, to him who rides in the heavens. Very clear, Yahweh. Psalm 104, bless the Lord, O my soul, O Lord, Yahweh, my God, you are very great. Again, he makes the clouds his chariot. Again, this epithet, this description, very well known for deity, not a lesser being, deity. Isaiah 19, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud. Now, I said it occurs 5 times. I've just given you 4. Every time the description is used in the Old Testament, it is used of Yahweh, the God of Israel. Because the point is, it's not Baal who does this stuff. It's Yahweh. Duh. Okay, so the biblical writers are looking at, addressing their audience and saying, look, if you're looking at Baal this way, you're missing the point. You got bad theology. It's not Baal who's behind all this stuff, who controls this stuff. It's Yahweh. It's the God of Israel. Now, 4 times it makes the connection, essentially dissing Baal and saying, it's really Yahweh, the God of Israel, who is this great thing. 5th time, here's where it shows up. All right, I messed that up. I'm going to skip there. Here's where it shows up the 5th time. I'll come back to the other. Daniel 7. I saw in the night visions, and behold, upon the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. It's the only time that a deity title, deity description, is used of a second figure. And it's this human person guy in Daniel 7. And we know that he's not the God of Israel. Why? Because he's already in the scene. He's the Ancient of Days. So you have a very clear reference to a second deity figure. Again, they're picking up on this. I want to go back here and pick up with Jesus against the Word, and we'll hit all these things that we just traversed. Now, we know this passage. Who's the word of the Lord in the Old Testament? Yahweh. Who is the word in the New Testament? Jesus. The Word became flesh. No one has ever seen God. The only God who is at the Father's side has made him known. Jude 5. Who was it that rescued the people from Egypt and took them to the promised land? Well, it was God, it was Yahweh, it was the angel, it was the presence. Oh, and by the way, Jude says it was Jesus who saved a people out of the land of Egypt. Again, Exodus 23, Judges 2. The name, Jesus prays. Think about the name. The name in the Old Testament, the name theology, that phrase, that word, is often, again, a circumlocution, a substitution for the divine name itself, for God himself, the essence, the presence of God. So Jesus prays, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world. What did Jesus tell everybody, that God's name was Yahweh? He didn't have to do that because it occurs about 5,000 times in their Old Testament. If that was the point of this passage, he'd say, like, hey, go read the thing. Or you already know what God's name is. That isn't the point of the language. When Jesus says, I have manifested your name to the people whom you gave me out of the world, he's saying, I showed them you. While I was with them, I kept them in or by your name, which you have given me. I kept them through your power, your attributes, your presence. That's what gave me my ability. Again, he just didn't go around uttering consonants. Is the point. I made known to them your name, and I will continue to make it known, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them and I in them. The rider in the clouds, Son of Man. Where does Jesus quote this passage in the New Testament? This is when he's on trial in front of Caiaphas, the high priest. And the high priest stands up and says, don't you have any answer to make? I'm hearing all these accusations about you. Don't you have anything to say, Jesus? What is it that these men testify against you? But Jesus remains silent. The high priest says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And then we think, because this answer is kind of odd, we think it's sort of just a throwaway. Jesus is trying to be clever or cryptic. No, he isn't. Jesus says, you want to know? I'll give you an answer. You have said so, but I tell you, from now on you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. You want to know who I am? I'll tell you. I'm the Son of Man in Daniel 7. That you know is a deity figure. That's who I am. And we know that that's what Jesus meant and the way Caiaphas took it because of the next verse. Then the high priest tore his robes and said, he has uttered blasphemy. No more need of witnesses. Again, he makes himself equal with God. Now, we don't have time to go through all the material leading up to the New Testament, but the two powers in heaven idea, because it's in the Old Testament, was very well known in Jewish educated circles and close readers of the Hebrew Bible. I just took you through a sampling of the passages where those questions come up just as you read it. In between the Testaments, between the Old Testament and when the New Testament was written, the so-called 400 silent years, the intertestamental period, there are many Jewish writers who speculate on who the second power is. And this is pre-Jesus. So it really divides into two groups. Some thought that the second power in heaven was a glorified human believer. Abraham, Adam, Jacob, Moses, they all show up in intertestamental literature as a candidate for the second power. And there's all different rationales attached to it. Abraham because he was the friend of God. Jacob because he's the prince of God, and all this stuff. The other category was angels, some lead angel like Michael, Gabriel. There was one angel called Yahoel. He is referred to as the lesser Yahweh in Jewish texts. Combines the two names of God, Yah and El. There are scenes where this angel is up there with God doing stuff. The point is that Jews between the Testaments felt very free to speculate and discuss the two powers because there's something going on there in the Old Testament. Now, what was an offense was therefore not the two powers. What was the offense was that these crazy people called Christians running around in the first century said, well, we know who the second power is. Can we suggest something? The second power is Jesus of Nazareth, and that's the guy you just killed. That just didn't go over really well. And it created a significant wedge. I mean, it became a litmus test issue, which is why in the 2nd century the Jewish community decided to declare the two powers in heaven a heresy. And that has been the story ever since. That's what Siegel's book was about. It used to be part of Jewish theology. We want to look at the third person, and I approach it this way. Once you know what's going on with the second power, there are certain things in certain passages that pop out that add the Spirit into the mix, or that refer to the Spirit the same way as the second Yahweh figure is referred to in certain passages. If you look at Isaiah 63, I will recount the steadfast love of the Lord, all caps there like the English convention, that's the divine name. According to all the Lord has granted us, the great goodness to the house of Israel. Again, this is a sort of a rehearsal of the history of Israel. In verse 9, in all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. So now we have the angel introduced, the angel of his presence. In his love and in his pity he redeemed them. God forgave them for all their rebellion. He lifted them up, carried them all the days of old. But they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. Therefore he turned to be their enemy. Who's he? Is he the Spirit or God? And himself fought against them. Where is he who put in the midst of them the Holy Spirit? So you have three, and there's not a whole lot of overlap until you look at the same historical overview in Psalm 78. The two verbs here in blue, rebelled and grieved, show up, and they are the same Hebrew words in Psalm 78, how often they rebelled against him and grieved him in the desert. But in this case, it's not the Holy Spirit they're testing. They're testing God, the Holy One of Israel. So just as the angel and Yahweh get linked in certain passages, here you have an instance where the Spirit and God get linked, and the angel is also there. So you have, again, a third figure that factors into the discussion. Ezekiel 8. Ezekiel says, then I looked, and behold, a form that had the appearance of a man. Okay? Human appearance, guy. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness, like gleaming metal. That comes right out of Ezekiel 1. He put out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of my head. Now, up until this point, you're thinking, again, because of the language, you're thinking of the figure on the throne in Ezekiel 1. He's embodied there, too, because he's sitting on the throne. Okay, I got it, Ezekiel. And then Ezekiel says this, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven. Well, now, wait a minute. I thought it was this human divine guy from chapter 1 that we were talking about. He grabs you by the hair, but it's the Spirit who lifts you up. So are they different or are they the same? Again, there's ambiguity there. Why not just say, and he used the Spirit, or with the Spirit he lifted me up? No, it's the Spirit. And you read through the rest of it. He has a conversation. They see the God of Israel in verse 4, and then in verse 5, he said to me, now wait a minute, who's talking to Ezekiel? Is it the man guy, the divine man? Is it the Spirit? It can't really be God, because God's there in the vision. The Son of Man, lift up your eyes now toward the north, and they have a conversation. And if you look at the last blue part, Son of Man, do you see what they're doing? The great abominations the house of Israel are committing here to drive me far from my sanctuary. So how many are in the picture? It's more than one, but is it two or three? And again, you just get this, again, feeling that There's at least two, but there really could be three here. And who's doing the talking and who's not? There are just passages that have these sorts of ambiguities in them. So that when you get to the New Testament, this is why, again, looking at the Old Testament, you have two Yahweh figures. The angel who is but isn't Yahweh. And that angel character, here's God, here's Yahweh, here's the angel, they're the same but yet they're different. The stuff that this angel is described as is transferred to Jesus in the New Testament. And so we have Jesus who is but isn't Yahweh. Well, we get that. But did you ever notice there are 4 or 5 places in the New Testament that refer to the Spirit as the Spirit of Jesus, the Spirit of Christ? In one place, right after he's referred to as the Spirit of God. Just as Jesus is but isn't God, the Spirit is but isn't Jesus. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in their midst. Okay. Again, there's this sameness but difference going on with a third person. That's where you actually get New Testament Trinitarianism. It's not the pronouns, which is typically how it's argued in theology classes. But it's a lot more complicated than that, and also I think a lot more profound than that. Again, just these categories that they have.